Welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to continue with the same area geographically and historically that we were dealing with in the last lecture. But I'm going to really give some background in terms of a particular area in India that will then occupy us in the final lecture in this particular portion of the course, dealing with the Thomas Christians in India. This lecture is meant to sort of set up so we can get into a more detailed study of the theology of that particular group. And so let me begin here with the historical theology in Asia in the age of colonization. The story of the age of discovery and colonization, particularly in India, involves the Portuguese. It was Vasco da Gama, a Portuguese explorer, who landed in the port of Calicut in India on May the 20th, 1498. He had sailed around the southern tip of Africa and up the eastern coast of the continent to Mombasa, modern-day Kenya, and there encountered an Indian sailor or navigator who knew the way to India. After a 23-day voyage, he and his crew became the first to sail all the way from Europe to India. The arrival of the Portuguese in Calicut in 1498 may have signaled a new epoch in Asian Christian history, but by no means did it represent the beginning of Christian presence on that continent. In India, reliable sources indicate that the continual presence of Christian congregations from the 3rd century to the present day, from the 7th century, Indian congregations belong to the network of the Nestorian Church of the East, which we introduced last lecture, whose influence during the 13th and 14th centuries extended from Mesopotamia into Central Asia, China, from Siberia to southern India. In the Middle Ages, European sojourners such as Marco Polo and John of Monte Carino repeatedly provide accounts of Christianity in India. One 15th century document is the testimony of the Venetian merchant Niccolo Conti, who traveled to India in 1415 and 1439. He claimed to have visited the church where Thomas was buried. So when Vasco da Gama and the Portuguese first landed in India, they met not only Nestorian and Thomas Christians, but others who were clearly not Muslim. These they took to be another type of Christian, but they soon realized they weren't Christians at all. They actually were dealing there with Hindus, which was a religion that they had never encountered before, obviously. First, the relations between the Portuguese, who were Roman Catholics, of course, and the Thomas Christians, who were, as we have seen, Nestorians, were cordial, as the Thomas Christians recognized that the newcomers were not Muslims, but somehow Christians from the West, and were originally accepted as somehow brothers, since they named the name of Christ. However, the relationship between the Indian and St. Thomas Christians and the Catholic and Portuguese Christians proved to be ambivalent, this author says. It was more than ambivalent, it began to be hostile, actually. Before long, each side became increasingly conscious of their religious differences, and this is why this is of interest to us in terms of historical theology. The St. Thomas Christians did not recognize the authority of the Pope in Rome. They didn't know anything about the Pope in Rome, really. They didn't require celibacy for the priests. Again, that was a Roman Catholic development. And they did not recognize the 7 sacraments of the Church. They traced their heritage again to the Nestorian Patriarch in Mesopotamia, and their ecclesiastical language was Syrian, not Latin. So the Portuguese found these differences to be something that they really couldn't abide by and were less accommodating. In the middle of the 16th century, at the time the Catholic Church was in the throes of its reaction to Luther and the Reformation, the Portuguese Catholics began to force the Nestorian Thomas Christians to accept Catholic doctrine and practice. At the Synod of Diamper, and this is one of the most important dates in the Eastern Church, particularly for historical theology, the Synod of the Emperor. In 1599, the Thomas Christians were forced to join the Portuguese colonial church, and the records, writings, and artifacts of the Thomas Christians were destroyed, which was a really tragic event on so many levels. Tragic for the Thomas Christians at the time, tragic for us in terms of understanding the heritage of the Thomas Christians. Again, just another one of the outrages perpetuated by the colonial powers, much to our loss mutually. The Synod of the Emperor was the council that formally united the ancient Thomas Christians, forcefully united, we should note, Christians of the Malabar coast of southwestern India with the Roman Catholic Church. Again, as we've seen, it was convoked in 1599 by Alexio de Menzies, Archbishop of Goa. The Synod renounced Nestorianism, which you can expect they would have. Nestorianism had been rejected centuries earlier. The local patriarch represented the Assyrian Church of the East, to which the ancient Christians in India looked for ecclesiastical authority. He was removed from jurisdiction in India and replaced by a Portuguese bishop. The East Syrian liturgy of Adai and Mari was, quote, purified from error, that is, accommodated to or adjusted to the Western theology of the Roman Catholic Church, and Latin vestments, rituals, customs were introduced to replace these ancient traditions. The forced Latinization and disregard for local tradition were accompanied by violence and led to schism among the Thomas Christians in the mid-17th century. It should be said that the Thomas Christians themselves had a number of schisms, as Christian groups often do, but this was particularly, again, devastating turn of events. These events, the Portuguese persecution of the Thomas Christians, pretty much set the pattern for the next decades and centuries. And so this is what basically closes off for us interest in historical theology, because then all of the churches that were planted, or in this case forcefully adjusted to the Roman Catholic Church and to Western theology, basically just then picks up the debates and the developments that happen back in the West. And so very little of really theological historical interest happens. Everything is just in the East becomes a reflection of what's going on back in the West. The colonial powers, Portugal, Spain, the Dutch, more or less Christianized, that is, Christianized according to their theology, the Asian lands that they conquered and colonized. The Jesuit Francis Xavier arrived in Goa in May the 6th, 1542, and much of the next 3 years he spent on the southeastern coast of India. Now that would have been on the opposite side of the subcontinent from where the Thomas Christians had been and where the Portuguese were. After baptizing hundreds of converts, his travels through India, he moved on to establish missions in the Malay Peninsula, then to 1549 in Japan. He wanted to go to China but never reached China. On December the 3rd, 1552, he died of a fever on the island of Sanxian off the Chinese coast as he attempted to secure entrance to the country, which was then, at that time, closed to foreigners. The Jesuits who followed Francis Xavier established solid, if bureaucratically and doctrinally heavy-handed institutions after him. Eventually, they did reach into China. However, some introduced the practices of accommodation that made it easier to establish Christian works, but at the price of altering the teachings of the faith. For instance, this is something that's interesting for us in terms of historical theology, I guess. One Jesuit named Matteo Ricci, established a mission in China. And by 1601, he even had access to the imperial court in Beijing. Ricci became something of an expert on Confucianism and was well-versed in Taoism and Buddhism. His most famous work was a tract entitled The True Meaning of the Lord of Heaven. This was a pretty interesting piece of work, which was an attempt to explain Christianity using and indeed incorporating Chinese philosophical and even Confucian terms and ideas. In The True Meaning of Heaven, Ricci did not explain the Catholic faith as entirely foreign or new. In other words, he tried to sort of say for the Chinese, look, this is not something that you should be surprised at. This is something that's you're very familiar with. And he managed to argue that way because he said that the Chinese culture and people always believed in God, and that Christianity is simply the completion of their faith. The key to his system was using the Chinese term, the Lord of Heaven. And we don't have time to get into it here, but if you know something about Chinese history and a little bit of Chinese philosophy, going back to the early Qi dynasty, Lord of Heaven, or the idea of the mandate of heaven, something that was hard to describe, but nevertheless very central to their philosophy, even their way of government. And Ricci was just picking up on this term, the Lord of Heaven, Jianzu, which was based on the Jiao term heaven, to use as a Catholic name for God. So he also cited many synonyms from the Confucian classics. So it's a very interesting read, and particularly if you have a passing interest in both Christian theology and in terms of Chinese philosophy. However, his method was controversial, as to say the least. It was rejected by some, but emulated by others, and could be considered to be an early attempt at contextualization, but I think a contextualization that most of us would probably find unacceptable. The history of the development of colonial Christianity is too much to get into here, and would take us beyond the purposes of our course, again, which is about historical theology. Suffice it to say, as I've said earlier, developments in Christianity and its theology in Asia, from these early stages of colonialization and mission up to and through the 19th century, was most often just an extension of what was happening back in the home ports of the colonial powers. So for our purposes, in terms of how the theology developed, it pretty much just kept reflecting whatever arguments or developments were going on back in Western Europe, were pretty much the same kinds of things that were happening in these colonial churches. And so again, while a very interesting and important history on its own, in terms of historical theology, doesn't lend a lot of interest for us. Not until the late 19th century were there efforts to create a non-Western or national forms of Christianity in Asia, and these early forms of indigenization were often led by native Christian people and homegrown indigenous church leaders. And just as a sort of a quick list of the different independent church movements, in Ceylon, there was an independent church that was attempted in 1878. It was marginally successful. In India, and the National Church of India was attempted. Again, this was heavily influenced by the colonial powers, but nevertheless with a certain interest in making it somewhat more Indian in terms of its culture anyway. Japan. Japan was never a country that allowed Christianity to develop very much at all. A recent movie about the attempts to bring Christianity to Japan on the part of Jesuits was compelling, if historically inaccurate, a movie of just a few years ago. But nevertheless, again, not much in the way. Not until 1901 was a notable attempt at an independent church movement in Japan. In the Philippines, the Iglesia Filipina Independiente, again under the colonial powers, but at the time when just before the Philippines came under the jurisdiction of the Americans, again an attempt to have an independent church. In Korea, the independent church movement again was fledgling, but not really very well received. And so we can see that it really waits until the middle years of the 20th century before a separate sort of indigenous theology began to be contemplated seriously. And really, that's somewhat beyond the bounds of our particular course right now. So we will stop there, and we will return to the subject, again, that I find most interesting about theological developments in Asia, and that is surrounding the Thomas Christians in India. And we'll pick that up in the next lecture.